In this lesson, we'll discuss the differences between absolute references and relative references. These are two different ways of looking at cell navigation in our Excel workbook, and they greatly affect how the macro recorder is going to interpret all of our navigation. The default setting in Excel is absolute references, which means that macros will note the actual address of the cell that we are navigating to. For example, if I have absolute references enabled, which is default, and I click in a macro into cell B1, the VBA recorder will interpret that as a absolute reference to cell B1. You can think of the word absolute as meaning definite or final or fixed. If somebody tells you, I know I'm 100% absolutely right, you know that they're 100% certain of something. And in this case, it's the exact same kind of idea. The place where we're going to end up, the cell location, the range, is certain. It's guaranteed. It's always the same thing. If we go into cell B1, the macro recorder will treat that as an actual reference to cell B1. In comparison, macros recorded with relative references are relative. They look at navigation as relative to a starting cell, compared to a starting position. While absolute references are more concerned with the final destination, where you end up, relative references are more concerned with how you get there. So the way the macro recorder looks at navigation is in a sequence of steps, like move 2 cells to the right and move 3 cells down. It doesn't matter what the final cell is, it matters the journey of steps to get there, which allows macros that are recorded with relative references to be used in a lot more locations because they're not so constrained, they don't have so many limitations, because they're not bound to ending up in any specific location. The easiest way to demonstrate the difference between these two is to actually record a macro with both. So in this lesson, we're going to record 2 macros, one with absolute references and one with relative references. It's going to be the simplest kind of macro. We're going to put our cell cursor into cell A1, click into there, and in both of our macros, as soon as we start recording, we're going to navigate 1 cell over to B1, enter a value in the cell, and then just end the macro completely. And that's it. So let's begin with absolute references. I'm going to click Record Macro. I'm going to give this macro a name of Move Right Absolute. This is an example of absolute references. Let's click OK right here, and we are actively recording. So I'm going to press the right arrow key on my keyboard to go into cell B1. I'm going to type in a value here, let's say hello, and I'm going to press Control plus Enter to enter the value in the cell without moving. So Control plus Enter, okay, looks good to me. So I'm going to click Stop Recording, and we have our very first macro. Next up is a macro using relative references. So I'm going to delete my value in cell B1. I'm going to navigate back into cell A1. This time, I'm going to enable the Use Relative Reference setting right here. You'll know that it's activated because it's going to have a gray background under the setting. So we're all good here. We can now record a macro with relative references. Let's call this macro Move Right Relative. Let's click OK here. We are now recording. Once again, exact same procedure. Right arrow key to go to cell B1. I'm going to enter the value hello. Control plus Enter. OK, it's entered in the cell. And now I can stop recording. Let's take a look at both of these macros in our actual VBA editor. So I'm going to open up Visual Basic. You can do that right here by clicking this key. And right here under Modules, we're going to have Module 1. That's where all of our macro code will be collected. Let's open that up. These little lines in green are what's known as comments. They are completely ignored by VBA. They're just used to leave notes behind for programmers, and the macro recorder will make a couple of them for us, but they're negligible, so we can go ahead and delete them just to make these macros a bit more compact and readable. So let's delete the ones there, as well as the ones in the second macro below. Let's also buy ourselves some space so we can compare these macros. And here we have it. So I know that some of this syntax is still going to be a bit unfamiliar, but hopefully you'll get the general gist of what's going on here. At the very top, we have our absolute macro, the one recorded with absolute references. And just as I mentioned earlier, notice that all of the cell references, the range references, are definite. They're absolute. They're fixed. The very first line of code here selects the range that encapsulates cell B1, right? A literal reference to B1. This second line of code, which is actually identical between the two macros, simply writes the value hello to that cell. The more important line is the very first one. We're selecting cell B1 explicitly. In comparison, in the relative macro, We are starting at the active cell, which represents the currently activated cell, the one that the user has selected, and we're navigating with this offset method. We're going to dive into that a little bit later, but what it does is it essentially navigates. It moves to somewhere else in the spreadsheet. And this 0, 1 syntax means 0 rows down, 1 column over. So we're moving over relative to our original cell, 1 column over. This syntax right here, range A1, is a little bit confusing because this is a relative macro. It's actually a little bit of what I call that extra useless VBA code that the recorder generates for us. We can actually go ahead and remove this. It's actually a little bit confusing, and the macro will still work regardless. This is much better. So we're starting at an active cell. We're moving over 1 column to the right. We're selecting that cell, and then in that selected cell, we're writing the exact same value, hello. So this one is relative from where we start, and this one will always end up in cell B1. Now let's take a look at how these macros will actually work in our Excel workbook. I'm going to go ahead and delete the value in cell B1. And the important thing here is that I'm actually going to navigate to some random cell in the workbook. It doesn't really matter where. So let's say D6 for me. It doesn't matter where you go. I'm in cell D6. I just want to make sure I want to turn off this reference. It won't really matter because the macro has already been recorded. I just want to go back to Excel's default. Let's go ahead and run our 2 macros in a row. So I'm going to open up my macros dialog box. Here it is. And let's execute move right absolute. When I execute this, we're starting in cell D6, but what happens here? Well, we have our value of hello written in cell B1. Why? Well, because our macro is absolute. So when we recorded it, remember, we literally referenced cell B1. That's how it interpreted our movement 1 cell over. It said to itself, oh, they moved into cell B1, and then they wrote the value hello in there. That's an absolute reference. That's how I'm going to record it. Let's go ahead and delete this value in cell B1. Let's go back into another cell. I'm just going to go into D6 again, just to kind of have an equal experiment set up. But this time, when I execute a macro, I'm going to execute move right relative. Let me just move this box a little bit out of the way here and execute this. And now we're going to end up in cell E6. Why? How come when we recorded the original macro, it was cell B1, but now we're in E6? The answer, of course, is because of relative references. Relative references don't care about the final destination. They're recording relative to where we started from. So when we started in cell A1, relative references interpreted cell B1 as 1 cell to the right. So when we started the macro from cell D6, it once again applied the same methodology, 1 cell to the right, then write the value hello, and thus the value ended up in cell E6. To summarize, absolute references target a specific cell, a specific location, while relative references target a cell relative to a starting position. And as much as it may seem like a small difference, it actually has a huge impact on how successful a macro can run. You really have to know which option you should use if you're going to be using the macro recorder. But that's all there is to cover in this lesson. I hope you're excited to tackle your very next challenge.